Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics. It's been a few months since you've heard from us last, but we're excited to be back with a couple exciting interviews over the course of this next month. First, we'll be diving into Cold War history. We're joined today by Stuart Reid, author of the Lumumba Plot, a fast paced and deeply researched account of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first prime minister, and its devastating consequences. We're excited to have Stuart with us to discuss his excellent research. And just for some background, Stuart is currently a Senior Fellow for History and Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and was previously Executive Editor at Foreign Affairs from 2008 to 2024. Stuart holds a BA in Government from our very own Dartmouth College, graduating in the class of '08. Stuart, it's great to have you on the show, and welcome to Toast and Topics.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks.
Before we get into Lumumba's 2 months in power, I want to take a step back. One of the things that stopped me in my tracks reading your book was your point that on the day Congo became independent in June 1960, there were fewer than 20 Congolese university graduates in the entire country. That's an astonishing figure, and it speaks volumes about the way that Belgium ran the place. Belgium's colonial rule was deeply extractive, and unlike Britain and France, they made almost no investment in building an educated local elite. So even the country's first cabinet was full of men who were brilliant political organizers, but who had been systematically denied professional advancement. So, can you walk us through the history of Congo to begin with, how Belgium came to control Congo in the first place, and how that system left such a profound political and administrative vacuum at the time of Congo's independence?
So the colony dates back to the 1880s when King Leopold II wanted to secure for himself, in his words, a slice of this magnificent African cake. And so he sent Henry Morton Stanley on an expedition to the Congo River Basin. And at the Berlin Conference of 1888, if I have the date correct, that was when Belgium, or excuse me, actually, an important distinction. King Leopold II was granted authority over the Congo River Basin, and so it differed from other colonies in that it didn't belong to the state, the European state in question. It belonged to the monarch himself. His King Leopold's rule provoked a sort of international human rights outrage, and led to the colony being transferred to the Belgian government. Um, and one interesting fact that always sticks in my mind is that King Leopold II, who was obsessed with the Congo and very proud of his colony, never in his entire life set foot in it. But it was an extractive rubber and ivory state. And when it was transferred to the Belgian government, um, as you mentioned, they invested very little in developing any sort of local institutions or an educated populace. And this differed from the French and British strategies, where while they were still involved in the inherently immoral business of colonialism, they granted more authority to local political elites. They wanted to develop sort of these proto-democratic institutions that weren't meaningfully democratic, but sort of had the trappings of it, and indeed set those colonies up for more success at the time of independence. But Belgium had an entirely different attitude towards its colony. The catchphrase that the Belgians used was "no elites, no problems." The idea being that if you kept the Congolese uneducated, unable to organize politically, unable to travel across Africa, unable to travel to Europe, if you censored the information that came in, if you formally closed off all avenues to higher education, you could have this sort of politically stunted population that wouldn't rise up and demand independence. And this worked for a very long time. And in the 1950s, uh, Congo was far behind other colonies in terms of an independence movement. So you can see this in the person of Patrice Lumumba himself, who, just as a brief biography, who was born in 1925 in a small village, moved to the regional capital of Stanleyville, now Kisangani, and joined the colonial administration, working for the post office, became um, a notable personality in town. He was what was called an évolué, which is French for evolved person, which was this official status that the Belgian administration had, where you could apply for a certificate that showed that you were, quote, Europeanized. They would come to your home and look at your bathroom, see how you uh, whether you ate with a fork and knife, tested your French. And this was a status for which Lumumba eagerly applied and was granted. And so in Stanleyville, he was this involved in these associations that weren't political because that was banned and not really on anyone's mind, but it was a place for elite Congolese to gather and discuss issues. And Lumumba is eventually fired from his post office job and thrown in jail because he's caught embezzling, which he admitted to. And then in prison, sort of writes this book manuscript, which is very indicative of where Congolese political thinking was at the time. This is the summer of 1956. Across Africa, independence movements are breaking out. Some are violent, some are not. And Lumumba writes this very mild-mannered manuscript where he's basically requesting for certain additional privileges for elite Congolese such as himself. So he's not calling for independence. He's not, declaring the system fundamentally racist and immoral, but asking for sort of special privileges and thanking the Belgians for all they've done. Partly this was strategic. He was trying to curry favor with colonial officials, but I think it was also indicative of a political evolution in progress and illustrating just how much the Congolese political class had been sort of kept from developing. So just to fast forward a bit to independence, things happen, and fast forward is the right verb because things happen extremely quickly in the late 1950s. There are anti-colonial riots in the capital, Leopoldville, in 1959, and that convinces the Belgians that they really need to offload this colony as soon as possible. In 1955, a Belgian academic wrote a book or a pamphlet called the 30-Year Plan for the Emancipation of the Belgian Congo. And the idea was that by 1985, the colony would finally be ready for independence 30 years later. He almost lost his job because this was seen as a radical position to take, that was far too fast a timeline for independence. Yeah. But as I mentioned, things changed quickly. The Belgians realized they needed to get rid of this colony or else they would face sort of Algerian-style war. And so that was when it was decided that independence would happen in June 1960.
Yeah, really interesting. Another thing I remember from your book is just how quickly the Belgian population that was in Congo at the time got out. That number was in the hundreds of thousands, right? And just very rapidly over even Lumumba's short time in power, they kind of vacated the place.
Yeah, there were
so sudden.
Two waves of exodus. One was pre-independence. A lot of people were worried that there was going to be some sort of crisis, and so families would send their wives and children home, but the husband would remain in the Belgian Congo. That sort of thing. The schedule for school exams were moved up so children could leave early. But by and large, the Belgian, mostly Belgian population stayed in Congo after independence on June 30th. But then things deteriorated extremely quickly. On July 5th, the army mutinied. So Congo had an all-white officer corps, a sort of holdover from colonialism, and the black rank and file rose up, understandably. And then they started terrorizing, marauding the streets and terrorizing the population. And so you had this second, much bigger exodus where the white population fled en masse. And that was a particular problem for Congo because, as you mentioned, the Belgians had kept the Congolese population from advancing. And so it was really the Belgians who ran the country. Everything from, train engineers and dentists and judges to, air traffic controllers and so on. And so in an instant, you had much of the expertise just instantly disappeared from the country, which exacerbated the crisis.
Yeah. And of course, that framing that you have is quite ominous for a lot of the events that we're going to be chronicling over the rest of this episode. But before we do that, I think it would be helpful to just take a step back and talk about some of the people who really were involved in this story. And Patrice Lumumba is probably the most important of those characters. In your book, you paint him as this incredibly charismatic orator, but also someone whose intensity and patience could a lot of the time alienate potential allies and get him into unfortunate situations. I mean, really, he is such a character. At one point, he was moonlighting as a beer salesman, as you document before getting into politics. And so I'd love it if you could just give us a portrait of this man and talk about what his rule was like during the very short time that he was in power.
Sure. So to pick up sort of where I left off when we were last talking about him, he was in prison. He wrote this sort of mild, meek manuscript. Then he was released from prison in 1957, and he wasn't able to get a job with the colonial administration, having been caught embezzling, and so he moves from Stanleyville to the capital of Leopoldville, and as you mentioned, becomes a beer salesman, where he's promoting polar beer and traveling to bars and acting as a salesman. And he then dipped his toe into politics around 1958. And that was when there were starting to be these sort of proto-political movements. Lumumba was not at the vanguard of that wave of political parties. In fact, someone who would become his rival, a man named Joseph Kasavubu, was much more ahead and prominent in that regard. But Lumumba co-founded a political party called the Congolese National Movement, and that there were many political parties sprouting up at this time, and what distinguished it from the others, most of the others, was that Lumumba was calling for a unified Congo and a strong central government, which was sort of swimming against the currents, because Congo was, as we've discussed, a sort of fiction of geography where you draw lines in Berlin and claim that this is one single polity, but of course contained and contains incredible diversity, ethno-linguistically, and so on, and is just, if you look at a map, a massive country that that doesn't, in some sense, make sense. So many other political movements were calling for, a much more federal, confederal system where individual provinces had a lot of power, and the central government was weak. Lumumba wanted a strong central government, a unified Congo. And I think this in part stems from his own peculiar biography, which was that he was from a relatively small ethnic
Hmm.
group, the Tatela, and he had moved a lot. He was fairly peripatetic. So he had, grown up in this small village, migrated to Stanleyville, which was not close to his village, and then moved to Leopoldville. So he had sort of become Congolese over the course of decades and not as tied to a particular ethnicity or place as many of his rivals. Um, and at the roundtable conference I mentioned, it's decided that there will be parliamentary elections. I mean, it's decided, first of all, that there will be a thing called a parliament and a parliamentary system. Um, and those elections are held in May 1960. And Lumumba's party gets more votes than any other parties. And so, therefore, just before independence, he's asked to form a government and become prime minister. You asked a little bit about his style of governance. I think he was a politician who was an excellent campaigner, but those skills didn't necessarily translate well into governance. So he was um, very politically astute. The negative way of framing that is sort of a finger in the wind politician, but the positive way of framing that is a politician in touch with popular attitudes and moods and willing to um, change tack when
Yeah.
necessary. Um, and he also, as you mentioned, was impatient. He was, blunt and demanding. Um, but I think here's where it's important to put the man in context with the events, because Lumumba faced a truly unprecedented and unimaginable series of crises that were facing him, and so any leader would have struggled in those circumstances. And we can get into the events in a moment, but um, yeah, Lumumba, he frustrated so many people. I mean, he captivated so many people. The Congolese, he really had a true popular base of support, unlike any other Congolese politician. But also when he, was meeting with Western diplomats or even his own political allies, he would constantly frustrate them by, refusing to compromise, by changing his mind, even small things like, being late to meetings and, canceling things at the last minute. Um, but he was also, um, truly in touch with the Congolese political mood, and he was, uncompromising on the question of wanting a real independence for his country.
Yeah. I mean, he's just such a fascinating and powerful character. And I do think it's worth now getting into the events that transpired once he took power. I think one of the important things to note is that the rapid departure of Belgian colonial governance basically meant that a lot of these institutions that he was presiding over needed to be significantly repaired or rebuilt on short notice. And that was a bumpy transition. For example, in the book, you note that the Katanga province in eastern Congo very quickly wound up essentially leaving the fold and going into a kind of open revolt that Lumumba, of course, really wanted to put down because he was, at the end of the day, a nationalist. He was someone who believed in strong federal power. And so, with all of that in mind, it is important to think about the relationships that Lumumba cultivated with powers outside of the Congo. For example, the United States and the Soviet Union, as he was trying to basically enlist support to, provide some level of order to his country. And so that gets us to this, really interesting dilemma that he was facing on how to align himself between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And of course, Lumumba was first and foremost a nationalist, but when the UN and Western capitals didn't deliver the help that he wanted, and this is something that you can absolutely talk more about, he did turn to Russia for transport assistance and arms. And of course, that triggered alarm bells in Washington, where he got stuck with the label of a communist sympathizer, even though, as you show, he wasn't really necessarily that at all. And so, just based on your research, what were his actual feelings toward the US and the Soviet Union, respectively? Was there any ideological affinity with Moscow, or was he really just making a series of pragmatic, finger in the wind, so to speak, plays to try to bring order to his country in the short term?
So let's back up and first explain why Congo was even attracting the attention of the United States and the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
which it hadn't been pre-independence, basically. Um, so after independence, you have the Army Mutiny on July 5th. Independence is June 30th. July 5th is the Army Mutiny. The Belgian population then flees en masse. And then on July 11th, the province of Katanga in the country's southeast announces its secession, which is problematic in particular because that was the mineral rich province. It was the main contributor to revenues for the new state, and also had a large Belgian population that was sort of holding on. And so this secession was had a local indigenous element to it, of Congolese not wanting to be ruled by a faraway capital, but was also backed by Belgian interests, mining interests, and the Belgians there. Um, so the country's falling apart before his very eyes. There's a mutiny, there's a secession, and Lumumba calls on the United Nations to help put his country back together again, essentially. And so the United Nations, led by Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, sends a massive peacekeeping operation to Congo extremely quickly, and sort of this valiant effort. The troops were mainly fellow African countries. The Soviet Union and the United States were cooperating on providing airlift services, although it was much more American than Soviet. And so there was this sort of impressive moment of international cooperation orchestrated by Hammarskjöld, aimed at putting the country, stabilizing the country and putting it back together again. But as you alluded to, that effort didn't go well. And the fundamental question was what to do about Katanga. The UN did not want to forcibly reintegrate the province. It saw that as interfering in an internal matter, and worse, risking an actual shooting war, which was not their mandate. Lumumba was obsessed with retaking Katanga and thought that since he had invited the UN troops in, he could order them to help his government regain control. So that was the fundamental dispute. And Lumumba first tried to get the UN to do what he considered it should, and failing that, then turned to the United States, traveled to Washington, D.C., tried to meet with President Eisenhower, who was out of town, asked for American aid, even at one point called on U.S. troops to be sent to the Congo, but was rebuffed at every turn because the United States obviously didn't want to further own the Congo crisis and preferred to work through the UN, and also wasn't entirely sure what to make of Lumumba and how pro-American he was. So to your original question of what his ideology was, first and foremost, the Congolese were not thinking about the Cold War. They, as one of Lumumba's friends and allies put it, the main axis in Congolese politics was, were you pro or anti-Belgian? And some politicians were, more willing to work with Belgium than others. And the question of the Soviet Union and the United States and East and West was just not relevant in the Congo. It was not something that was on Congolese politicians' minds. And that said, Lumumba, all the evidence suggests that he was more pro-American than pro-communist. As I mentioned, he called for American troops to go in the Congo. He would speak about sending Congolese youth to American schools for education. He repeatedly disavowed communism and said that he was, a Catholic, and really the main ideology he had was anti-colonial. So he had no interest in substituting Belgian domination for communist Soviet domination. But that message sort of got lost or wasn't received in Washington. So as you alluded to, he ends up calling on the Soviet Union for help. He's been turned down by the UN, turned down by the United States, sends a message to Nikita Khrushchev asking for Soviet military help in retaking secessionist provinces. And by that point, there was another secessionist province. So that is, as you said, when sort of the alarm bells go off in DC.
That's a great segue to start talking a little bit more about Washington's role. And one of the most gripping sequences in your book takes us inside a 1960 National Security Council meeting. And according to people in the room, President Eisenhower at the time verbally authorized the CIA to, quote, eliminate Lumumba. And within weeks, Allen Dulles had dispatched a man, Sidney Gottlieb, who went to Congo with poison toothpaste. So before we get to that moment, can you just walk us through the escalation a bit more? What developments over the summer of that year moved Eisenhower from suspicion of Lumumba to actually approving this type of operation?
So Lumumba's visit to Washington went terribly. He did not impress the State Department officials he met. And he left empty-handed. And so when he goes back to Congo, things have deteriorated even more. He was gone for something like 2 weeks, which was a large percentage of the country's entire existence at that point. And one of the ways in which the situation ended up deteriorating was that, as I mentioned, another province, South Kasai, announced its secession. So you have, and that was the diamond-rich province. So you have yet more breaking apart. Lumumba's military forces then engaged in a campaign to retake that province that Hammarskjöld called, quote, genocide. His troops committed atrocities. So that's one sort of track of development. The other thing I should mention, a man whose name has not come up yet, is Mobutu. So Joseph Mobutu was Lumumba's dear friend, his sort of political protege in a way. He had been in the military in the 50s and then became a newspaperman. And Lumumba became friends with him, and Mobutu joined Lumumba's political party and sort of was his right-hand man, answering his mail, arranging his correspondence, that sort of thing. And after independence, after the mutiny, Lumumba puts Mobutu in charge of the army, thinking he's a close ally and he has military experience. Mobutu, you're now in charge of the military. And so one factor that's happened is that relationship has broken down over the course, over the July and August 1960. Mobutu finds Lumumba sort of all sees the flaws that we've discussed earlier. He isn't. He's alienating Western politicians and diplomats. He's being too impulsive. And then also just their personal relationship had degraded, and Mobutu felt like he was sort of now on the outside and not able to have good access to Lumumba and influence over decisions. But the real turning point for the attitude in Washington was Lumumba's outreach to the Soviet Union. That was an unforgivable sin in the context of the Cold War, where the United States really saw the world divided into two blocks, and what was called the third world at the time was seen as up for grabs. And there really wasn't a nuanced understanding of, being truly non-aligned and understanding that a country could be neutral. Lumumba always claimed he wanted his country to be neutral and avoid the Cold War, split. But Washington could not accept that. And in fact, sort of, I would argue, bent over backwards to interpret evidence in weird ways that would fit its thesis that Lumumba was secretly pro-communist. And there were sort of different versions of the theory. One was that he was, a secret communist who was aligned with Moscow. The sort of other version was that he was just plain incompetent, and while he might not be super pro-Soviet, he would be a useful vessel for them, for the Soviets to use. But once he asks for military help from the Soviet Union, that sort of confirms the worst fears about Lumumba. And so there's this August 18th, 1960 meeting, which I can talk about briefly. So the topic that day is Congo, and Lumumba's latest anti-UN statements come up, and Eisenhower, who's no fan of African independence to begin with, says something to the effect that Lumumba must be eliminated. And we know this for a few reasons. One, a note taker present at the meeting would later testify that Eisenhower had said this. He didn't remember the exact words, but the note taker recalled that everyone in the room sort of was stunned into silence for a little while they digested this order. Another scrap of evidence is when I was in the Eisenhower Library in Kansas, I came across handwritten notes from the meeting, which included the word Lumumba with a big black X written next to it, which is not proof, but an interesting additional piece of the puzzle. But most important, we know what happened next, which is that Allen Dulles gets word from the president's national security advisor, Gordon Gray, that Eisenhower really was serious about what he said in that meeting and wants the CIA to get to work. And so that he does. And so Allen Dulles, director of the CIA, instructs Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's top chemist, to procure a poisonous substance and figure out a way to get it into Lumumba's food or toothpaste. And so Gottlieb flies to Congo, meets the CIA station chief there, a man we haven't talked about yet,
Yep.
named Larry, and hands him this poison along with rubber gloves and a surgical mask and a syringe, and explains that the CIA station chief is to find a way to get this into Lumumba's food or toothpaste. So it's this, it sounds like something out of a spy fiction, but it's all really happened, and we have the day by day cables instructing um, Devlin on this, and was it just spoke to how paranoid Washington was, that it was willing to try to assassinate a leader of an independent country because it feared he was pro-Soviet.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And one of the really striking things about everything that you've described is just the timeline here that's kind of serving as the backdrop. I mean, really only 6 months before all of this, Congo was still a colony of Belgium. As you noted, the relevant political axis for the Congolese was whether they were pro or anti-Belgium. It didn't have much to do with Cold War geopolitics at all. And so, in a sense, I almost feel terrible for Lumumba and the Congolese in that as soon as they got their independence, they got thrust into this other, set of geopolitical machinations that I'm not even sure if they like really had the chance to fully appreciate the dangers of before um, they started to take irreconcilable turns that ultimately led to Lumumba's assassination, as you're kind of getting at here. So before we get to all of that, I do think it would be worth talking about the operations that the CIA had in Congo at this point, and specifically, it would be useful to talk about Devlin, who you've already mentioned. He, of course, played a large role in the events leading up to Lumumba's assassination, but more than that, he had a extremely large role in Congo after the assassination when Mobutu was in power. So if you could just quickly talk about the CIA's role in the country, that would be great.
So before independence, the CIA, like the rest of the US government, did not think that Congo was going to be, that much interesting was going to be happening there. And a good piece of evidence for this is that they sent an untested young intelligence officer named Larry Devlin to become station chief. He was 38 years old, which was young. Um, and so he actually isn't in the Congo at the time of independence. He's on vacation, about to assume his post, on vacation in Europe when he gets word that he's needed immediately. And so he rushes to Congo just after the crisis begins. And he really is this fascinating character. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book is because he was, this sort of all-American World War II veteran who then was recruited into the CIA at Harvard, and was sort of a bon vivant, and wore a fouillard and was the life of a cocktail party, and in some ways extremely good at his job and competent in terms of developing local sources and agents, but also played a really damaging role in Congo's history, I would argue. And so one of the key things he did was cultivate Mobutu. So after, in August 1960, when Lumumba is in power and seen by the West as flailing, incompetent, potentially pro-Soviet, Devlin identifies Mobutu as an ally and someone who can be useful to Washington because he's seen as reliably pro-Western, a man who is disciplined and has control of the military, most important of all. And so an important development takes place in September 1960, which is that Mobutu announces that he's launched a coup, although he says it's not a coup, but it is a coup. And he takes power for himself, declares that Lumumba is no longer in power, and he's stepping in himself. And he had told, by Devlin's own account, he had told Devlin he was going to do this, and essentially received the okay from Devlin, and who delivered him a satchel of cash of $5,000 to help, pay off officers for the coup. So Devlin played a large role in supporting Mobutu's takeover of power. And that moment in September 1960 really redirected the entire trajectory of the Congo until the 90s, because Mobutu, spoiler alert, ends up staying in power for more than 30 years. And you really can trace that to Devlin himself.
I want to talk a little bit now about the United Nations as well. In 1960, the organization was still in its formative years, and it had a growing sense of authority and moral weight. But the Congo mission really became an early and very public stress test of the UN. The UN's peacekeeping wouldn't really take military action early on, despite Lumumba's pleas. And later, UN troops also stood by as he was arrested, citing strict neutrality. So, from your perspective, was that neutrality sort of a principled reading of their mandate, or did it cross into harmful inaction that effectively shaped the outcome in some ways?
So, the UN started out with the best of intentions in Congo, but reality quickly intruded. And that Hammarskjöld thought it was possible to keep Congo out of the Cold War. In early 1960, he had declared that his ambition for Africa was to keep that continent out of the Cold War. That proved impossible in the case of the Congo. So early on, Hammarskjöld shared the United States' frustration with Lumumba. And Hammarskjöld's man in the Congo was an American diplomat named Ralph Bunche, another fascinating character who's sort of in many ways forgotten today, but deserves to be more remembered. And Bunche was extremely frustrated with Lumumba. And the whole UN operation at the beginning had a real sort of pro-American bias, even though the Soviets had voted for the Security Council resolution authorizing this peacekeeping mission. They soon regretted that, and sort of understandably so, because the operation became very aligned with American interests and American views of Lumumba, American preferences. And in fact, much of Hammarskjöld's staff was American. And he himself, as a Swede, was sort of a man of the West. And so there was this pro-Western bias. And the instance that really came out the most was the way in which in September 1960, when Mobutu took power, the UN really put its thumb on the scale to prevent Lumumba from accessing the radio station and really sort of coming back to power. That's the clearest instance of the UN really directing events in Congo in a way that was anti-Lumumba and pro-Mobutu. So up until the Mobutu coup, the United States and the UN are largely aligned. What then happens is there's an extreme backlash to the UN's seeming anti-Lumumba bias, and particularly among what was called the Afro-Asian bloc, meaning African and Asian countries, many of them former colonies. And so Hammarskjöld had to sort of backpedal, and then you start to see UN and US interests diverging. And the broader context here is that 1960 was a year in which the UN was really morphing from a smaller organization of mostly, great powers and Western countries into one that was more representative of the global population, but less coherent and more divided. And so that sort of that transition is happening right at the time of the Congo crisis. And you see that in the way that the African and Asian countries are condemning Hammarskjöld for the UN's actions in the Congo. And he's sort of trying to satisfy that bloc, but also, keep relations with the Soviet Union and the United States. And so he has sort of almost an impossible job of triangulating between all these different forces. But as you mentioned, it was a stress test for the UN because it really had done nothing like what it was doing in Congo before. It had peacekeeping missions, but they were small and they were mostly monitoring truces, mostly in the Middle East. And this was an entirely different mission where there were many more troops. They were tasked with, on the one hand, restoring order to the streets, on the other hand, sort of replacing the missing Belgians in the administration of the new state. And they had responsibility for an entire country and sort of making it work. And that was ultimately an impossible task that it failed at. And that would prevent the UN for the rest of the Cold War from taking on anything similar. In addition to the fact that the Soviets regretted having approved the mission and therefore were never going to vote for something similar again. And so if you look at the list of UN peacekeeping missions, there's basically this long lull after the Congo operation, and only late in the Cold War, when sort of West-East relations had thawed a bit, do you start to see the UN resuming that role, which is sort of now what we know it for today most.
Yeah, fascinating.
Before we wrap up, Stuart, I want to broaden this out now to the overall implications of some of your findings. So, do you think that the Lumumba affair set a template for later Cold War covert actions, including the combination of inflated threat perceptions, regime change, and long-term instability in other countries? And if so, do you see echoes of that pattern even in today's great power competition in Africa and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is important to know is that the Congo operation in the CIA and Washington more broadly was viewed as a success. Here you had a potentially pro-Soviet leader who, thanks to clever American operations, was sidelined from power and permanently eliminated from the Congolese political scene. And in his place, you had a seemingly reliable pro-Western dictator who could be counted on to do America's bidding. So at that simplistic level, the Congo operation was a success. Devlin was promoted for his experience in Congo. His daughter told me that it, quote, made his career. And so this certainly didn't cause any rethinking of the Cold War paranoia that had led to these policies. It didn't cause any rethinking of the idea that third world politics were to be managed and controlled because the indigenous leaders themselves could not be trusted to make their own decisions. And so that's a motif you see continuing through the rest of the Cold War. The problem, of course, was that only in that narrow sense could you code Congo as a success. First of all, Mobutu was hardly a reliable pro-American autocrat. He ended up inviting in North Korean military advisors. He kicked out 2 successive American ambassadors for failing to show him proper deference. So he was a difficult client, and he ran his country into the ground. It was, in the immediate period following Lumumba's death, there were years of instability in Congo, and only thanks to the largest CIA paramilitary operation at that point in history was Mobutu able to stay in power and regain control over the entire country. Basically, Lumumba's followers in the East launched a massive rebellion that nearly brought the Mobutu government to the ground. And then over the 1970s and 1980s, the U.S. continued to support Mobutu, who really hollowed out the country. And the bottom fell out in 1996, 1997, when at that point, the U.S. had sort of cut him loose because the Cold War was over and he had outlived his usefulness, and he was becoming a sort of embarrassment of a client. And the country collapsed and was invaded, and Mobutu fled and then died of cancer several months after he fled. And so that the country, the Economist put it, so it was then renamed Zaire because Mobutu had this Africanization campaign. And the Economist put it at the time very aptly, I think, that there's now just a Zaire-shaped hole in the middle of Africa. And so began the deadliest conflict since World War II, the Congolese Civil War, which, in some form and respects is still going on today, but, raged particularly intensely from 1996 to the early 2000s. So you really can draw a straight line from that the collapse of the country in the Civil War to the decisions that the United States made in 1960 and 1961. But to answer your question about modern great power relations, I would say that one of the big lessons from the Congo crisis is to not view developments in what was then called the Third World, now one might call it the Global South, through the lens of your own great power rivalry. And that really what these countries want most is autonomy and development. And they don't want to be caught up in somebody else's great power conflict. And they often aren't acting as if they do want to do that. And so there can be a tendency to sort of view every decision that, say an African country makes in terms of, is it pro-China or pro-American? And the events I detailed in my book show just how tragic the outcome can be when you try to fit developments into your own Cold War. And also when you try and sort of tilt a country off its natural political axis and don't let it develop according to its own ideology and political impulses. I mean, the Congo, because the United States supported this authoritarian Mobutu for so long, it never got to be the country that it would naturally have been. And while that was probably not going to be Jeffersonian democracy or a Nordic social welfare state in the middle of Africa, it could have at least sort of followed the middle of the road experience for independent African countries and been free of the mass violence and civil war that it ultimately endured.
That's really powerful. These are, I think, wise words for policymakers in both the United States and China. And it does seem like a flaw in human nature almost that people in policy, but also people generally, have this tendency of interpreting the actions of others through their own lens or worldview.
It's like the
And
fundamental attribution error, but applied to international relations.
exactly, exactly. Um, One thing I wanted to just emphasize about your book, the Lumumba Plot, is that what makes it so good is not just that it's well written and that the narrative is fast paced and gripping while simultaneously being very informative. It also is really shining a light on a portion of history that I just don't think has gotten enough attention from many other authors. And kudos for that, number one. But number two, I really am curious about what prompted you to start writing this book to begin with. What gave you the idea for the book? And what was the research process for this like? I mean, my hunch is that if you are doing a history on the events of Western Europe or something along those lines, the archival material is probably just easier to access than what you had to deal with doing a lot of this research really for the first time.
So I got interested in this topic in a roundabout way. I had the chance to travel to the Democratic Republic of Congo, as it's now known, in 2014. And I was writing an article about a man named Russ Feingold, who is a former U.S. senator who lost his Senate seat to the Tea Party rebellion, and then in sort of a surprising second act was appointed by the Obama administration to be the U.S. Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region of Africa. And so I was writing this more political story about a senator, but as part of it, I got to travel to Congo and tag along with with Feingold for like a week. And that was the first time I'd been to Congo. And it was such a captivating country. I mean, at one level, just physically, especially in the East, it's extremely beautiful and like nothing I'd ever seen. But more to the point, I started reading up on the country's history, about which I had known very little, and realized what an interesting story there was about its independence, an interesting and tragic story. I mean, for one thing, the Congo crisis was front page news of the New York Times practically every day in the summer of 1960. But it later got overshadowed by other Cold War crises, and I had learned nothing about it in school and knew very little. And so I wondered, how did something that was such a big deal, it was the axis on which the world was turning at that very moment, later become forgotten? And then the other thing I noticed is, as I began to read and dig, there were just these fascinating characters. Lumumba himself, above all, who was so complex and was hardly the cartoon that his supporters or detractors made him out to be. Mobutu, who again was also very complex and interesting. Dag Hammarskjöld, who in many ways is this tragic figure, and we haven't even mentioned this, but he died in the Congo crisis en route to a peace deal that was in the works in the Katanga province. And then Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief. So there were all these really larger than life characters. And then finally, what made me actually able to write the book was that more sources had come out. In 2013, a big trove of CIA cables was finally declassified and published in the State Department's Foreign Relations of the United States volume. And that allowed me to reconstruct sort of the day-to-day operations of the CIA and just how it was supporting Mobutu and acting against Lumumba. So that's how I got interested in it. As for the research, you're right in that there are essentially no Congolese archival documents in Congo from this time. The Lumumba government was short-lived. It was actually only 2 months Lumumba was in power. And so the documentary evidence from that government itself is thin. So I had to sort of work around the story in many ways. A lot of UN archives were extremely helpful. State Department archives, the CIA cables, as I mentioned, and there's some Belgian archives. And then to get the Congolese side of the story, there were a lot of sort of forgotten memoirs written by Congolese politicians and published in French in the 60s and 70s. And so I had to spend a lot of money on Abe books, tracking down obscure Belgian publications, that there were probably only, 50 copies in the world or something. And then also oral histories that, other people had done with various policymakers at the time. And finally, I actually traveled to Congo and interviewed some of the children of the Congolese politicians at the time. I met with Lumumba's daughter, one of his sons, both of whom were very, very helpful, and other politicians' children I met with, interviewed Larry Devlin's daughter. So, those interviews are less reliable for sort of dates and facts, but but can be very useful for sort of color and emotional reactions and setting the scene. And so it was really combining all these different sources together that was the main task of writing the book.
That's awesome. Well, Stuart, thanks so much for spending part of your weekend with us and for walking us through this history that you've really vividly outlined in the book. For our listeners who are interested in actually reading the Lumumba Plot, we will link the book details in the episode if you'd like to purchase a copy.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. This was fantastic. And to everyone in our audience, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you again in a few weeks where we'll have another interview coming up with Michael Beckley, who's an expert on American foreign policy, where we will be looking at the paradox of a fractured America that remains remarkably dominant abroad. So we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. If If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and follow us on the podcasting platform of your choice, and try sharing it with a friend or family member to see what they think. We'll catch you next time.